The big story in all of the major news outlets of America is that reading and math scores plummeted during the pandemic. Fourth grade scores for worst performers could take decades to rebound and affect the economy in the future. Experts say. Not sure we should believe the experts. We may actually find kids are resilient. Who knows? We may come up with ideas. But the basic story that's out there today is that because of the pandemic, kids have regressed in math and reading. The New York Times headline is most instructive. The pandemic erased 2 decades of progress in math and reading. And the subtitle, The Results of a National Test Show Just How Devastating the Last 2 years have been for 9-year-old school children, especially the most vulnerable. The problem here is the pandemic did not erase 2 decades of progress in math and reading. Even the more passive voice of the Wall Street Journal, reading and math scores plummeted during pandemic, new data show, doesn't quite capture what happened. What really happened is not the pandemic erased 2 decades of progress in math and reading. Progressives erased 2 decades of progress in math and reading. Now, I'm sorry, I try to be somewhat analytical here and not go straight into partisan chum in the water, throw red meat around, seize on it for Republicans. But somebody's got to be made to account for this, and it's not a single Republican. It's not a red state leader. It is blue states in blue areas of the country, including in red states in the hardcore blue areas of certain states where the problem exists. This is not a phenomenon that impacts states like Florida or Georgia or Texas or Arizona. This is a problem that impacts California, Oregon, Washington, Illinois, New York, Virginia, before Glenn Youngkin, Washington, D.C. This is a problem that only impacts poor kids in blue states. This does not impact most of red states, except in hardcore progressive enclaves like DeKalb County, Georgia, very progressive area of the state of Georgia, where local school officials did their best to stymie education during the pandemic, furious with Brian Kemp for reopening the state. Stacey Abrams, you will recall, wanted Brian Kemp to shut back down the state and keep schools closed. In states like Virginia, Northern Virginia, a well-to-do part of Northern Virginia, a lot of federal employees, a lot of tech companies, a lot of defense contractors. Parents, when the schools shut down because of local school boards, a lot of parents pulled their money together and hired tutors to keep their kids in the education game. The schools were closed. The parents hired tutors. And the local Democrat-controlled boards of education vilified the parents for doing it. They suggested the parents would be contributing to racial inequity by allowing their kids to get educated when non-white kids weren't doing it. In fact, many non-white parents were invited into these programs by the white parents to keep their kids going forward. But there were some kids who fell behind, overwhelmingly poor. By the way, it really doesn't have a lot to do with kids not being not white. It has a lot to do with kids being poor. It was poor white kids fell behind too. But the media obsesses about intersectional equality, so screw the poor white kids. We've got to worry about the black and Hispanic kids. Poor kids fell behind because of progressives. When parents went to school boards to demand they reopen schools, the school boards treated the parents like terrorists. Parents were attacked by the press. Now, the very same press that worked with progressives to attack any parent who wanted school open claims the pandemic erased 2 decades of progress. The pandemic did no such thing. The progressives did. Progressive teachers unions did. Randy Weingarten, wanting all schools to be shut down, did. Progressives in the New York Times did. Progressives in the Atlantic did. Progressives on CNN and MSNBC did, demanding schools be shut down, demanding little kids wear masks so that they couldn't read facial expressions. The American Academy of Pediatrics for years maintained children needed to see facial expressions, and then during the pandemic said, no, they don't. Kids are resilient. They'll be fine. I know at least a dozen people right now whose kids are in remedial speech therapy because they had to wear masks for so long. They have a hard time with emotional learning and articulation of words because they couldn't read lips to learn. Turns out it was real, and turns out kids maybe aren't quite as resilient as they told us at the time, although I suspect more resilient than they're telling us now. Why? Because their solution is federal bailout, of course. The New York Times story is pretty instructive. In math, black students lost 13 points compared with 5 points among white students, widening the gap between the two groups. Research has documented the profound effect school closures had on low-income students and on black and Hispanic students, in part because their schools were more likely to continue remote learning for longer periods of time. Why? Why? Because of progressive policies. It's infuriating. Now listen to how they cover up the discrepancies between blue areas and red areas. This paragraph alone is the most revealing paragraph. In some parts of the country, the worst of the disruptions were short-lived, with schools reopening that fall. But in other areas, particularly in big cities with large populations of low-income students and students of color, schools remained closed for many months, and some did not fully reopen until last year. Big cities. Who runs most of the big cities in America? That would be Democrats. That would be Democrats. And then listen to this quote. There's a Dr. Ho quoted. The national tests, he said, tell the story of a decade of progress followed by a decade of inequality. Then the shock of the pandemic. It was a 1-2 punch. It erased the progress. It exacerbated the inequality. Of course. And then, of course, Janice K. Jackson, the Chicago Public Schools leader. Now a board member of Chiefs of Change, which represents state education and school districts. The results should be a rallying cry, she says, for getting students back on track. She called for the federal government to step up with big ideas, invoking the Marshall Plan, the American initiative to help rebuild Europe after World War II. This is how dramatic it is to me, she said, adding that politicians, school leaders, teachers, unions, and parents would have to set aside their many disagreements that flared during the pandemic and come together to help students recover. No more of the arguments, the back and forth, the vitriol, the finger pointing. Everyone should be treating this like the crisis that it is. If it's a crisis, let the kids out of the public schools. If it's a crisis, give the parents options to pull their kids out of the failing schools. And they're not going to do that, which tells you they don't really care about the kids. They care about their power. I live in Georgia. It is the Republican Party in Georgia that is punishing the kids with public schools. No Republican in the state of Georgia at a leadership level is willing to push for the education reforms that Jeb Bush did in Florida, that Ron DeSantis is now championing. You know what the Florida Republicans did? Essentially, if you make less than $35,000 a year, I think it's $30,000 or $35,000 a year, or your parent's in the military, or your parent is a police officer or firefighter full-time, you get to go to any school. You get to go to school, wherever you want to go. If you're poor, you get out of the public schools. So what you get to do. A buddy of mine, who's probably going to listen to the podcast later, sent me all the data on this a while back. It's remarkable what he said is the situation. That the way that you can get your child a K through 12 income-based scholarship. You pay a little bit, depending on your income level. Dependents of members of the armed forces, active or reserve, or dependents of law enforcement qualify no matter the income level to be able to get into private schools in Florida. It's remarkable that we haven't pushed this. So if your annual income is $54,360. You get a great deal of benefit for your kids to be able to go to private school in Florida. The Step Up program in Florida. Why haven't other Republican states seized on this? You know, it's one of the reasons Florida has become a Republican state. All these Republican states like Georgia looking at becoming a swing state, it's the Republicans in those states who are screwed up in the head by not pursuing what Florida pursued. You give parents this entitlement, they get their kids out of the failing school systems. Guess what? They don't want to give up that program. Democrats hate that program because Democrats get so much money from public school teachers unions. They don't like the program. They hate the program. They want to kill the program. So the parents vote Republican. You want to fix what went wrong? You give parents the tools to get out of schools that are failing. Republicans in Georgia, Republicans in Texas, this is where the big fight's going to be next. Republicans in Texas, you're insane if you don't do something like what Florida did. You're absolutely insane not to do this. It's not only the right thing to do, it'll help you politically. Here's what's going to happen, though. Look at the student loan bailout. People who did the right thing are being punished to help people who didn't do the right thing. The responsible are being punished to help the irresponsible. It's only a matter of time before the homeschool families of this country, already vilified by the progressive left, they're bullied into taking a back seat to less educated kids who suffered during the pandemic. It'll be affirmative action for kids who suffered at the hands of progressive policies. That's how they're going to want to make it better. It'll just breed and foster resentment over time, but that will be their solution. Affirmative action for kids who are screwed over by progressive policies. The kids who went to private schools or to red state public schools that stayed open, they'll be punished to bail out the kids from blue states because that's the only thing the left is going to offer. Bailouts and affirmative action for kids who are poorly educated because of progressive policies. And the rest of you who took the time to get your kids a good education, your kids are going to get screwed over by the establishment, progressive left, by the press, by the Democratic Party, by the government itself, because your kids got smart while other kids regressed because progressives, not the pandemic, shut down schools around the country. In Georgia, Brian Kemp fought even the president of the United States himself, Donald Trump, to reopen the state of Georgia. Do you know how the media covered it? The Atlantic called it an experiment in human sacrifice. Georgia was going to figure out how much it cost in lives to reopen the economy. You know what the results are? Georgia's experiment in human sacrifice? The kids came away with better education than kids in New York, California, Illinois, and the like. Parents got their jobs back and their income went up. And they're surviving an economic downturn and a recession better than people in blue states. That's what Georgia's experiment in human sacrifice was. They didn't sacrifice humans. They sacrificed progressive ideology and proved that conservative policies worked to reopen the states, get kids back in school, get parents back to jobs, and the economy is roaring. The only people complaining are Stacey Abrams and her ilk, who thought it was a bad idea. The people of the state of Georgia are going to send Brian Kemp back to this governor's mansion because of it. The people in Florida, they're going to send Ron DeSantis back to the governor's mansion because he did the same thing. The people in Virginia replaced the Democrats with Republican Glenn Youngkin and gave the Republicans their House of Delegates because the Democrats listened to the teachers' unions and kept the schools shut down. It is mind-numbingly ignorant to me to see Republicans in states like Georgia and Texas and the like refusing to go along with school choice. It is now or never. The left, progressive policies about the pandemic, the federal government itself failed kids. This is the civil rights issue of our time, and Republicans should step up and get on the right side of history.